So, welcome to another show. It's all about shipping. I would say good morning from the UK, but Esben is joining us from Singapore, so it's good afternoon in Singapore, Esben. Thank you for joining our show. It's
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure and a great honor, of course, to have you with us today. Esben Poulsson is, of course, the chairman of the International Chamber of Shipping and the executive chairman of NSOPTE. He is also the author of A Life in Shipping, which is worth mentioning, I trust. And today he's joining us to discuss the impact of COVID-19, obviously, in shipping on a more general context, some of the initiatives that the ICS is taking jointly with some other associations, and generally to give us his overview on the impact and what this will mean for the industry going forward, the current situation, any suggestion actions, etc. So, without further ado, Esben, if you would like to, I don't know, make an opening statement if you believe whether we're taking this situation seriously enough, if we're overreacting, what is the general feel from your side?
Thank you, Gina. I think that we are taking this situation extremely seriously because it is an extremely serious situation. I mean, if you look at the speed with which this virus has spread, it's been absolutely incredible. I think I saw in the U.S. The first outbreak was sort of towards the end of December, end of January, early February. A few cases reported. Within less than a month, it was 500,000 cases. So the spread of this has been, by any standard, absolutely astonishing, and has, of course, created huge challenges, problems, issues across the world in really almost any industry that you can talk about, but certainly shipping being a major one. And our number one issue, I think, as is well known to your listeners, the number one issue that we and ICS and our fellow associations are struggling with or dealing with is the issue of crew change. Because unless this is dealt with, one of our members, quite correctly, in my opinion, the other day said, this is a potential ticking time bomb. You just cannot have seafarers going way beyond their normal tour of duty in already very stressful conditions. And equally important, those who need to join the ships for relief need to get to the ships because their families concerned depend on it. So as a human, well, as we always like to talk about people before profits, I mean, if ever there was a time that applied, I would have to say it's now. And so we are, in ICS, we have instituted twice weekly calls for our members. Bear in mind, our members are national associations as opposed to a direct entry. And we have usually between 25 and 30 people on these calls, exchanging a lot of very, very interesting and useful information. I think this has been a great thing. And in fact, we have many of our fellow associations dialing in as observers, and they also contribute to this. But of course, shipping has, we have economic challenges, commercial realities, and so forth. But the number one here now issue, for sure, is the issue of crew change.
I was going to extend a little bit on the impact from your personal perspective, but because you already mentioned the crew changes as, of course, the most important thing that is on the shipping agenda, I think, at the moment. As you said, the human element is coming first in this situation. You have recently, as ICS, as an association, joined forces with IATA, ITF, sending a plea to a joint declaration rather to the G20, asking them, or rather explaining that it has to be a unanimous kind of approach, and even set up a task force for this particular issue to try and get it resolved as soon as possible. Would you like to just comment a little bit, maybe explain the importance to the audience, which obviously for those who are in shipping, we do appreciate what that means, but maybe in a wider context, what this means, and how do you see this developing?
Yeah, I think in a wider context, I've always felt, and really for a very long time, that seafarers are sort of the unsung heroes of the whole supply chain, because I've been on BBC and I've CNN or not CNN, CNBC and Bloomberg, etc. And it's very obvious to me that when you talk to this media, there is not only a lack of understanding of what shipping is all about, but a lack of knowledge, and particularly a lack of awareness. And this is to some extent, or to a great extent, probably the industry's own fault, because we have traditionally been a bit sort of below the radar. In many cases, this is how ship owners have preferred it. But in the modern day and age, with communications and social media as it is, the days of trying to hide behind single-purpose companies are long gone, long gone. And that's a good thing too, because it is now everything is much more transparent. That's not to say that there are no bad apples. There are, and unfortunately always will be, but the standards have improved tremendously over the years through great efforts, through, in some cases, pretty sensible regulation. I would say double hull tankers has, for example, that came in the early 80s, I think it has been, I think, a good thing. And you only need to look at the statistics of the tanker industry, how incredibly it has improved. But nonetheless, most people in the greater public don't really care very much about that, because also shipping is not only to them invisible, but very often is out of sight, out of mind, because a port may not be visible from a city center. It happens to be here in Singapore, but that's probably pretty unusual. Mm-hmm. So most people don't really know what it's about. But I'm in a way sorry to say that a crisis like this probably will make people raise people's awareness of just the role that this industry plays in getting the 90% of goods are transported by sea, as I think probably many of your listeners would be aware. Mm-hmm. And the one point I want to make, and I've made many times, is that shipping is probably the key link in the supply chain. The supply chain is highly sophisticated and has been developed to a level of sophistication in recent years, which is absolutely astonishing in terms of what we call things like just-in-time delivery, just-in-time inventories, that everything the products are where you need them to be at just the right time. Shipping has played a major role in this. And when you then have a situation like now, where in some cases ports will tell a ship to just lay off for 14 days rather than letting the ship do its work and isolating the people and ensuring minimum direct interaction, physical interaction between shore staff and the people on board. Some ports are just stopping the ship from doing what it is supposed to do, and that is just not going to help. What we have pleaded for in the both in the note, the IATA joint note to the G20, but also in two separate letters we did together with the ITF, International Trade, the International Federation of Transport Workers, who represents the seafarers of the world. We've issued two letters to the G20 containing all sorts of practical, implementable guidance. And on the 27th of March, we, together with 15 other associations, issued a very, very detailed letter to the IMO, which I'm very pleased to say the IMO more or less accepted as was, and in turn circulated that to their 170 odd member countries to again raise awareness of this situation. But I'm sorry to say that at a time like this, where there are so many related issues to what this virus has done, of course, we are having to speak much louder than we normally would. We're having to be much, much more proactive than we normally would. I mean, an association in a booming shipping market, when everything is going well, you never hear about an association. But I would say at a time when the chips are down like now, that is a time for us to really step up with our fellow associations and show what we can do. And I can only say we're trying.
I think you've been doing an amazing job, and maybe this can be considered as a positive part of all of this crisis, that the voice has to become louder and people have to realize, because as you mentioned, not only the media, but generally there seems to be a lack of understanding of the role of this industry. How can they define key workers as doctors, nurses, grocery store workers, and truck drivers when there's no medical supplies being able to be transported around the globe, when there's no groceries? I mean, I think the perspective is a bit distorted at the moment. So maybe it was about time that we were able to. Then again, your comment does touch on other points, and I mean, port denying access and layup, and I mean, we're seeing what's happening with the cruising industry and everything. So it's just so unprecedented all the time. This time is just so unprecedented in so many aspects that you don't know really where to start solving issues from. Yet, as you mentioned, ports are denying and asking vessels to go on layup due to the situation. They've got the power to do it during this crisis, unfortunately or fortunately, or as each state deems fit. But even though during this crisis, because I have been in touch with some people who are on board and their friends and associates, and they're sharing concerns like, even though we have to work with limited supplies, we're not allowed to make the crew changes, which means some of us are long overdue already on board and exhausted, and this is against, even we could say, on a human rights level. Yet they still have to deal with audits like MLC and people coming on board, putting them at a higher risk, because obviously then the vessel is going to sail, and if somebody gets ill at sea, we all know that it's much more difficult to treat them. How would you, as an association or even a personal comment, whatever you prefer, I don't mind, because I understand it's not clear times for anybody to judge.
No, I think the Maritime Labour Convention in itself is something that I think we as industry should be quite proud of, because as far as I'm aware, we are the only industry on earth to have what is in fact a Bill of Rights that is global. I believe we are the only industry to have done that, and reaching that agreement at the ILO in Geneva took years and years. And we as ICS certainly played a very, very active role, along with several of our fellow associations, in making it happen. But as so often with a convention, you could argue that the compliance has been patchy in some respects. And the issue you're raising of certificates and related issues is one that we hear, I'm afraid to say, quite often. And at the moment, what we understand is that some flag states are very sympathetic to this to this situation, and are therefore taking a common sense approach and giving almost automatic 3 months extensions and that sort of thing, as indeed they should. I even heard the other day that one flag, I think it may be Marshall Islands, are trying to sort of do a distance type of approach to and I don't know how effective that is, but at least again it shows that people are, when the need is there for a different approach, then shipping has always been a very adaptable industry, and common sense will prevail. This is not to say that I think it's really a problem, because I've seen myself many times. I've been on board when a ship arrives after a long voyage, and the captain is bombarded with, be it the port authority, the agent, the charterers, the P&I club. Very often there's some insurance issue, there's some illnesses on board and whatever, and it is very, very stressful in these situations. So at a time like now, when there's already more than enough stress, then to equally have MLC issues on top of everything else is very tough, and it's something that we will definitely we have, and we will address it some to those concerned. But I mean, I think it's mainly an appeal to the flags to take a pragmatic approach and an understanding approach in what are exceptional circumstances.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. Because I mean, especially now, from on the one side, you're not allowing people to get off board, so obviously you're stuck with crew that have been worn out and having to increase the work rather than
Exactly.
It's not exactly the best formula going.
No, and I mean, and again, this is also, it's all part and parcel of the same issue. Is that contracts these days are shorter than they used to be, but then probably the demands are also probably greater, because with the speed of everything, things happen fast, and so contracts are shorter, and this is what people have gotten used to. But to go back to to me is a very, very key point. It isn't just the people on board. That's bad enough, and the stress and illness and so on is of great concern. But there's also the crew trying to get on board and earn their salary to support their families at home. In many cases, large families rely on this income, and when it suddenly isn't there, it's a huge social problem in some of these poorer countries.
Yes, true. Very true. From your personal environment, how have you been? I mean, obviously, okay, with the ICS work, you've got a very international perspective of what is going on. But maybe from within your company and the environment in Singapore, any comments?
Well, I mean, the environment in Singapore, we sort of got off quite lightly up until 10 days ago. We were. I mean, our restaurants were open with some distancing, some rules in place, but they were open and we could go to the office. Many companies voluntarily divided into teams so that fewer people were moving around. And the numbers were all looking pretty good, and things were sort of going the right way. And in the international press, Singapore was held up as a sort of an example of how to do it. Perhaps not quite on the standard of South Korea and Taiwan, but nonetheless, we were doing quite well based on our experience of SARS, which was the outbreak in the early 2000, 2003 and 4. But unfortunately, the numbers suddenly started to creep up, and at first it was considered that this was so-called imported cases, and so the airport was, closed to visitors. Even transit was closed to try and stem this. But the numbers went up again, and it has been uncovered within the last 2 weeks that the vast majority of these cases are from so-called dormitories that house overseas workers, typically from Bangladesh, India, and China, who come to work on construction sites in Singapore on a contract and then go home again. And there are many of them. And there have been outbreaks in these dormitories. So the government felt they had no choice but to implement a total lockdown in a similar way that you have in the UK. And what they've done is to attempt to isolate the healthy workers and place them in new facilities. They've chartered in some accommodation barges for starters. They've also taken over 1 or 2 exhibition halls and converting them into dormitories. So to separate the healthy from the ill. And then on top of that, we are now by law required to wear masks whenever we go outside. Even though if I go for a jog, I'm apparently allowed to sort of peel it down a little bit, because in intense exercise you don't have to wear a mask. So I just have it underneath. But it, and you're allowed to go and food shop the way you are in the UK as well. But that's basically it. So we're stuck at home, and I think it's not the way any of us really want to work, because human beings are largely social creatures. I certainly consider myself a social creature, and I miss very much interaction with other people. But of course, relatively speaking, compared to not only the seafarers, but many others on this earth, one is very lucky to at least have a a decent home to be in. So but it's a new situation here, and our lockdown is supposed to be until the 4th of May, and I think I can already sort of detect mumblings that could very well be extended.
Yeah. It is a very challenging situation, I must say, on various aspects. You did bring in the human, our nature to be social beings in general, excluding introverts, of course. On a society, yeah, I'm sure there's a portion of people who are really, really enjoying this this phase of their life, not having to go to the office, etc.
I know one particularly, my oldest brother. He lives in the mountains of Norway on a lake, and he likes people well enough, but he's not especially social, and now nobody can come up there, and he can't go down anywhere, so he's never been happier living by himself in the middle of nowhere. So
there's people who are finding this just fine. I must admit, personally, I am finding myself more productive at home because there's less distractions, or the more regulated distractions.
Yeah. I find slightly the same thing, actually.
Yeah. But on a society in general, this impact and on the economy, what do you think you have noticed, or what would be the changes that we will see going forward?
I was participating in a conference the other day on this very topic, and of course people have many theories, none of us know for sure, but I would say that I think that I think for sure people are going to be traveling less. I mean, I just think that's just a given, because the way that we've all learned to somehow manage with all this technology kind of shows that it's doable. And it's doable if you have to do it. If you have the option, no, we have to meet physically because it's very important, and blah blah blah. And of course, it is preferable and it's enjoyable, but we can get by in this way. So I would say one thing, and that's probably stating the obvious, is that I think that people will travel less. I think in terms of sort of business, in terms of the shipping business, and it's not particularly rocket science, but I just think we're in for tremendous volatility. I think that, for example, if there is an improvement in this situation, you're going to have a quite a big uptick in some segments, particularly dry bulk and container. So a little bit of a pent-up demand where suddenly the world is moving again. And yet, will nearshoring, which has been talked about for years, onshoring, nearshoring, will that become the new norm? Will 3D finally come about? It's already, at a time like this, 3D printing is making a bit of an impact. And so of course, we don't know. We're just speculating, and much will depend on the duration of this virus. But certainly, if it goes on for long enough, it's obvious that the economic fallout will be absolutely staggering. And when the press starts using the D word as opposed to the R word, that's not a nice thought. Yet at the same time, at the moment, stock markets have been going up, which is something that I can't quite fathom. But these markets must know something more than I do. But it's a very uncertain picture, and I think it'll be a very volatile picture.
Well, I think surely there's so much uncertainty going around, and you cannot really comment on what the impact would be. And I think it would be also very hard to determine how long this will last, or how long the effects will be following an improvement in the situation. But you've kind of touched upon what would have been my next question on how you assess the impact. I mean, shipping has so many sectors, but from the commercial shipping side, the cruising industry, I mean, it's seeing a phenomenal situation with all of the cruise ships except 6, I was reading yesterday.
Yeah, I think it's 3 now, actually.
3, are in layup, which, if just picturing this, because there were pictures going around, it's just quite incredible. trade, travel, which you mentioned already, or digitalization. How would you assess, if you want to elaborate a bit further on these aspects of the impact of this virus, or of this crisis, rather?
Yeah, it's. I think the big thing is going to happen is at a certain point, our government's going to have to make that awful decision as to, do they let this go on? And I'm talking now, if it goes on for between 6 and 12 months, the economic destruction will be so staggering, and the damage, the social damage, so great that any repair will become a very, very long-term project. And I suspect that a number of governments are going to near the point within the next month where they're going to say, well, we have to figure something else out here, because you saw in the US now another 5.2 million unemployed. So that's more than 20 million unemployed people. And it's, of course, those who need the work the most, because in America, a huge percentage of people live from what they call paycheck to paycheck. And, so I think governments are going to have to make this awful decision. You've seen what Trump is saying, and the governors in the U.S., and you've seen what Denmark, Norway, and Austria have done, and it'll be, and you've seen what Sweden is doing, which is in a way is an experiment that where the jury is still out, and it'll be extremely interesting to see how that actually pans out, because I think it's still a little bit early to say, but it may work. I mean, it may. But the brains around this world at this very moment that are applying themselves to, be it a vaccine or be it some sort of a magic cure, don't underestimate the ingenuity of mankind. And I mean, we can be optimists and hope that a breakthrough that we cannot see today will suddenly be available. I mean, I know it may sound like wishful thinking, but it is always possible. But as far as the real impact on a bigger picture, honestly, Gina, I would just be speculating, and I don't think that my speculation is any more valid than the next person's.
Yeah, that is quite true. But I think you did touch upon quite important points there, and I guess we just have to all wait and see how this is going to develop. In saying that, and generally in going forward, is there anything concrete that you believe the maritime industry will have to embrace as a change? I mean, even what you mentioned about digitalization or less travel, or any other kind of behavior that you foresee, and also, if you would like to add anything that we should aspire to keep from to take as a lesson learned, or as a valuable contribution to this industry. I mean, making our voice louder is, of course, something I strongly believe in. But from what would you say?
Yeah, the optimistic part of my nature tells me that if we, as shipping, if we perform well during this crisis, if we do our job well and act in a proper manner, the image of our industry, which is something I have fought and I feel very, very strongly about. In fact, when I entered this industry 49 years ago, people, the elders and wisest were all telling me, "Oh, we have a terrible image," But at that time, there was a lot of the old sort of gold chain, girl in each lap type tycoon, cigar, champagne on a huge yacht. There was a lot of that. Was very much, in a way, the image of ship owners at that time. Much more than today. There was a sort of fascination with it, I guess, characterized by people like Onassis and that type of very high profile, massive Greek owners. Some of those are still there today, but they're much more they're more corporate, and they're much more performance and excellence driven than their forefathers, who, I mean, they were, I'm sure they were perfectly responsible ship owners, but it was more, there was an image problem for shipping then, for sure. And then, you know, you had the Amoco Cadiz, you had the Prestige, the Erica, you know, these spills that were just horrendous. I mean, they're just terrible, and people trying to walk away from their responsibility and mishandling by port authorities, and just terrible. I mean, the Torrey Canyon was the worst one 52 years ago, which just really did a terrible damage to the coast of the UK. You know, as I said earlier, the improvements that have been made in that segment alone is staggering if you look at the statistics.
Mhm.
Because not only has the amount of oil that moves around the oceans increased it's probably doubled since that time at least, but you know, the safety record has just never been better. So, you know, it is, and maybe it is an opportunity for our industry to enjoy a public perception that we're really not such bad people, and that the vast majority of ship owners are very responsible people. I mean, you know, one of the pleasures I've had in my job as ICS chairman is when I was elected in 2016, I stupidly undertook to try and visit all our members. I visited 31 so far in Asia, North America, and Europe. And you know, everywhere you go, each jurisdiction is very different the way it does things. You know, even Cyprus and Greece are very different. Belgium and Holland are very different, amazingly different. And many of the issues are localized, if you like. But what I can generalize and say is that the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes to focus on performance, on better operations, on better ways of doing things, and you know, better training, everything towards an improvement. And perhaps the fact that we are so invisible is a reflection of the fact that we do a very good job. Because if we were terrible, then and there were accidents happening with great frequency, then it would be something else. There are still accidents, of course, and when they happen, they're awful. But in the great scheme of the amount of ships, 65, 70,000 ships plying the world's oceans, I think the safety record is just outstanding in relative terms.
True, very true. And I don't know if you want to make any other general comments before we go into the last question and wrap up the show. Anything you would like?
No, that's fine. That's okay. You can. I'm sure your listeners don't want to. They don't want to get too bored listening to all this stuff. So by all means, go to the next one.
I think so. I think it's very important to have this input, but I know your schedule is also very busy. So this is more like from a personal perspective. Is there anything that has struck you in this? It can be more something that you found unexpected or fascinating in this whole situation, either from an aspect of behavior or trends in general, or even political kind of approaches?
Well, it's interesting because someone, a friend of mine in London I spoke to the other day, said exactly the same thing. I said to him, is it my imagination, or are people just being a bit kinder to each other? Are people sort of just a bit more friendly to each other? And because I notice when I do my jogs here in Botanic Garden, which never ever happened before, people say good morning, and even sort of behind their mask try and smile. Which never ever happened here before. And he was saying, well, in England it's much the same. And when you see these images of people on the balconies cheering the NHS, and when you see the Italians, I don't know whether you saw the ones with people with a bamboo stick and champagne glasses, you know, sort of, you know, I mean, I think there is a sort of a certain civil spirit that is almost sort of, in a way, almost a reaction to a war, you know, that at a time of when things are really, really tough, it can very often bring out the better part of people's nature. And I think actually one is beginning to see many examples of that now.
True. Actually, interesting enough, in the last panel that we had on the show, it was also mentioned that even though we did have video conferences before, it would be more straight to the point and to business. Whereas now, when you're talking with your colleagues, you will chat a little bit about how things are at home or on a more friendly, casual basis. So I think it's just what you're saying, it is bringing out good qualities in people, I guess, which we should hopefully keep going forward. Well, in closing, there's some comments on the show in general, but I think what it would probably be good to close with is that they're saying here that they agree with you that the unseen heroes of this are the seafarers, and they should receive the recognition and respect that they deserve. But what is an interesting statement, and I think you would probably agree, and if one comment, the whole world they're saying is in a lockdown situation, but sea trade is continuing to run more or less at normal, behind the scenes as always. But I think even from that, we can realize how vital this industry is for
very much so.
The world.
Very, very much so. You mentioned something earlier apropos the unsung heroes, and this is actually a really, really very important point that we have pushed time and again. You when you talked about key workers, our message in these letters to both IMO and to the G20 is that governments need to classify ports and seafarers and the shipping industry as key ports, key industry, key workers. This is really important. Why should an airline staff member, flight attendant or captain or whatever, be a key worker if a seafarer isn't? I don't understand that. It doesn't make any sense to me. But again, it comes back to, unfortunately, this issue that we are quite invisible. Our efficiency is taken for granted in many ways. I'll give you a quick story. I went on one of our company's container ships from Singapore to Hong Kong, and I told the office in Cyprus I can go this particular week in May. I can do. It was 6 months in advance. 6 months. I started tracking, and that particular ship fitted my dates. So I started tracking the ship every week. Every week, no change, no change, no change, no change, no change. I joined the ship in Singapore, not only on the day, but on the hour that they said she would arrive here. And this was 6 months before. Ship comes into Singapore with 14,000 containers. It discharges 4,000. It loads 4,000. It's here for 9.5 hours, and then it goes to Shanghai or Hong Kong or wherever. I mean, sorry, in this case, it went to Hong Kong and then on to North China. But I mean, that just brought home to me, if you were following a bulk carrier or a tanker, I mean, the itinerary would change by weeks normally. But these things, I mean, they run like a Japanese bullet train. You know, they're just so incredibly efficient and punctual.
It is.
It's amazing.
Incredible. Indeed. Well, thank you for sharing that story with us. I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to add as a final closing kind of comment from your side.
No, I just hope that I hope that our efforts at ICS with our fellow associations will bear fruit fast, because as I always say, we want action, not words. But to get action, we have to utter a lot of words. And we understand that governments are very, very, very pressed on a huge array of issues. But with all due respect, we think this issue is every bit as important as virtually any other, if not more so, because it is a supply chain and it is these essentials that we're talking about. And once you interrupt it, it's very, very difficult to reinstate it.
Yes.
So we hope very much, and I can only again assure your listeners that we will do all we can within our power to make this to solve this dilemma.
I think we're very lucky to have associations like the ICS, and actually all stakeholders, and seeing them come together in this crisis is quite important. So I'm sure that these efforts will be fruitful eventually, and hopefully this chaos will be coming to an end, or seeing improvement and light down the tunnel quite sooner rather than later. Thank you very much, Esben, for joining us today.
Really a pleasure, Gina. Nice to see you again. And yeah, thank you. And all the best.
Thank you very much. All the best with the work with the ICS and generally. And that was it, guys, from It's All About Shipping. I hope and I believe that we've touched upon quite some very important points for our audience. And tune in next Friday when we've got the series of our panel. More details will be following, of course. It was Gina Panayiotou from It's All About Shipping, Mr. Esben Poulsson. Thank you very much, and have a nice afternoon or evening, or depending on which part of the world you're in. Bye.
Thank you.